Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This time, we're doing a deep dive into something a little different.
Oh.
Yeah, the Republican Professor podcast.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and, we don't have, audio to play or anything.
Right.
It's more like we've got this whole stack of episode descriptions, and we're going to kind of sift through them and see if we can get a sense of, what the show's all about.
Exactly, yeah.
What kind of conversations are they having? What's the tone? Who are they talking to?
Yeah, what's their target audience?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So right away we see the host is Dr. Lucas J. Matter.
Okay.
And he's got a PhD, and he's also a U.S. Navy veteran.
Oh, wow.
So I'm already kind of intrigued.
That's really interesting because it suggests maybe a certain kind of, well, I don't want to say bias, but like a certain angle.
Yeah, perspective.
Yeah, perspective, exactly. Yeah. That might appeal to, say, a conservative audience.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the episodes that caught my eye features a Dr. Vernon Grounds.
Okay.
Who is described as a psychologist and theologian, but also the description points out that he's actually passed away.
Oh, wow.
So they're using his work.
Wow, so they're drawing on past scholarship to kind of, I don't know, frame maybe current events.
Yeah, and this particular episode is about pride in biblical and political phenomenology.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's
the idea of taking like a concept like pride, which is obviously a very kind of human thing.
Timeless, yeah.
Yeah. And applying it to current political events or even like the systems that we live in. I mean, that's a pretty fascinating approach.
Definitely adds a layer of depth.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at some of these other episode titles because some of these are pretty attention-grabbing.
Okay.
We've got Is Hunter Biden Above the Law? We've got Law and Ideology. And we've got Logic and Critical Thinking Should Be Taught in School Without Censorship.
Okay, well, right away, I'm noticing that a lot of these titles, they really kind of frame things as like an us versus them.
Right.
Which is something that you see a lot in political podcasts.
Yeah.
To sort of rally a certain audience.
Right.
Like, is Hunter Biden above the law? I mean, that question is...
It's pointed.
It's very pointed.
Yeah.
And then, without censorship...
Yeah, definitely.
That's sure to kind of rile people up.
Right.
Get people talking, get people interested.
And, maybe pique the interest of listeners who are already kind of skeptical.
Exactly.
Of certain narratives or institutions.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about politics. It's about shaping how people think and approach the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's definitely like a pushing a certain way of thinking.
Yeah, they're trying to cultivate a certain mindset, it seems like.
Right. And speaking of shaping perspectives, a lot of the descriptions highlight the podcast's support for various causes.
Right.
Like mental health and politics, deep conversations on theology and government, and individual liberty.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to almost create a community of listeners who share those values.
Right, exactly.
It's not just about presenting viewpoints. It's about kind of aligning the podcast with those specific values.
Yeah, and would you say that's kind of a common thing to see in political podcasts these days?
I think it's becoming increasingly common.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Podcasts are a great way to build a loyal audience who, feel like they belong to something.
Absolutely.
And then there's this kind of personal touch, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
They have an episode featuring the host's grandfather.
Yeah, James A. Mather.
Who was a World War II Navy pilot.
And the founder of the Mr. Steak restaurant chain. So... I mean, it's a great story.
Yeah.
But what does that have to do with the rest of the podcast?
Right. I mean, I thought that too.
Yeah.
But think about it this way.
Okay.
It's not just about the story itself. It's about what the story represents.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So you've got, this World War II veteran who's also an entrepreneur.
Right.
And he founded this classic American restaurant,
Yeah.
So it kind of evokes all of these images that are really powerful and really resonate with a certain audience.
Like, hey, I'm one of you.
Exactly, yeah.
I share your values.
Yeah.
I share your history.
I get you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really smart way to connect with the audience.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, before we get into the actual episodes,
okay,
I got to ask about the website categories.
Okay.
Because alongside politics and theology, we've got some real gems like Bureau Speak, Socratic AF, and ubiquitous crap that obfuscates the simple mission of education.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Socratic AF. Come on.
I love that they're using that kind of language because it's doing a couple of things.
Yeah.
It's establishing this very informal tone,
Right.
which you wouldn't necessarily expect
From a Republican professor.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also creating this kind of insider-outsider dynamic. It's
Right.
like, we get it, you get it.
Right.
We're all in on the joke together.
Right.
And anybody who doesn't get it, well,
They're not part of the club.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
So it's a really clever way to kind of like
Yeah.
build that camaraderie.
Yeah, and it makes it fun, too.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not just a...
too serious.
Yeah, it's
you know?
not just like super serious.
Yeah, you don't have to have a PhD to listen to this podcast.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a conservative-leaning podcast
Mm-hmm.
hosted by a PhD and Navy vet exploring hot-button political and cultural topics
Yes.
with a dash of personal storytelling
Mm-hmm.
and a sprinkle of humor.
Yeah, it's a good mix.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting combination.
Now, what does this all mean for the listener?
Well, I think it means that this podcast is really trying to create a space
Mm-hmm.
where listeners feel like they belong,
Yeah.
where they can engage in these conversations,
Right.
And where their values are kind of affirmed.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're given tools to think critically,
Yes,
but within a certain framework.
exactly. Yeah, it's like a guided tour of the world.
Right, exactly.
Through a particular lens.
And that's the beauty of podcasts, right?
Absolutely.
They can create these
Yeah.
niche communities
Totally.
where people feel heard and understood.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about how they're using
Yeah.
all these different elements, like
Yeah.
the episode titles,
Right.
the personal storytelling, the humor, to really draw people in and make them feel like they're part of something.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've got a pretty good sense of the podcast overall.
Yeah.
So
It's time to dive into some specific episodes.
yeah, let's pick an episode and see what we can uncover.
How about that one with Dr. Grounds?
Okay.
On Pride.
The pride one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
All right, listeners, buckle up. We're going deep
Yeah.
into the world of pride, politics, and maybe even a little bit of philosophy. All right, so we're back and ready to kind of dig into some of these specific episodes.
All right, let's do it.
And I think that the one that we left off on was that episode on pride.
Right, with Dr. Vernon Grounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, pride in biblical and political phenomenology.
It's not exactly a light topic.
Not at all.
It's kind of heavy stuff.
Yeah, but it seems like they're trying to connect this,
Yeah.
like this timeless human trait to both religious and political
Exactly.
indom texts. Yeah, and it makes you wonder, right? Like,
Yeah.
are they looking at pride as a sin? Are they looking at it as maybe even a virtue? Or is it somewhere in between?
Right.
And then how does that,
Yeah.
influence how we think about politics?
Right. So they're not just talking about pride as like
Right.
an individual failing,
Yeah.
but as something that can have like
Yeah. Societal implications.
broader
Exactly.
applications.
Yeah.
And I mean, bringing in the theological perspective too.
Right. I mean, that's a whole other...
A whole other layer
Yeah.
to this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. And speaking of potentially controversial topics,
Yeah.
there's that episode, Is Hunter Biden above the law?
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty pointed question.
It is. And it seems like they're tapping into this idea that certain people are just held to different standards.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, like there's a different set of rules
Exactly.
for the elite.
Mhm.
So it's not just about Hunter Biden himself. It's about this broader,
Yeah, it's about accountability.
concept of justice
Yeah.
and accountability.
Especially when it comes to people in power.
Especially when it comes to,
Yeah.
people in power. Like,
Oh.
are they really
Right.
subject to the same laws
Are they above the law?
as everyone else?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question.
It is. And I think it's a question that
Yeah.
a lot of people are asking these days.
Okay, and then we've got that episode on logic and critical thinking,
Right.
which really stood out to me.
Yeah. And that one's interesting because it
Yeah.
kind of gets at the heart of what they're trying to do with this podcast.
Yeah, like, are they just advocating for more logic and critical thinking skills in general?
Yeah.
Or are they advocating for, like, a very specific type of logic
Right.
that aligns with their worldview?
A very specific way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder.
Yeah. About the nature of critical thinking itself, right? Like, is it truly neutral? Or is it always going to be shaped by our values?
Right. Are we all just biased?
Right. Exactly. And
Yeah.
I think that's a question that they're grappling with
Sure.
in this episode.
Okay, and then, we talked about those kind of quirky
right
website categories,
Yeah.
the Socratic AF and all that.
That kind of stuff.
So how do you think that plays into this?
Well, I think it just shows that they're not afraid to have a little bit of fun.
Right.
It's not all serious.
Not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They're trying to make this stuff
Yeah.
engaging. They're trying to make it interesting.
Right, and it's not just for academics,
Right, exactly.
Like, you don't have to have a PhD
yeah,
you
you
know,
can be
to enjoy this podcast.
you can be a regular person and still get something out of it.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about these big ideas.
Yeah.
And we've talked about how they're using these
Yeah.
like specific examples,
Right.
like Hunter Biden and the host's grandfather.
Yeah.
What do you think is the purpose of that?
I think it's to make it relatable.
Okay.
You're more likely to remember a story
Right.
than you are to remember
Well, a dry lecture.
a dry lecture
Yeah.
about political philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think they're trying to kind of ground these abstract ideas
Yeah.
in real world examples,
Right.
so that people can connect with them.
So it's not just a philosophy lecture.
Exactly.
It's like
it's a conversation
Yeah.
about real life.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and it's a technique that you see a lot in podcasts, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You gotta keep people engaged.
Especially when you're dealing with these kind of potentially controversial topics.
Yeah.
You gotta find a way to connect with people.
Yeah, and make it personal.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the themes, we've talked about the examples, we've talked about the storytelling. What about the tone?
Yeah.
Is it all serious academic debate?
I don't think so.
Or is there some personality in there?
I think there's definitely some personality.
Okay.
I mean, remember those category names?
Yeah, the Socratic AF.
Socratic AF, yeah.
Ubiquitous crap.
Ubiquitous crap.
That's not exactly academic jargon.
No, it's not.
Right.
It's very conversational.
Yeah, it's like
they're your buddies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, come on in, let's have a beer and talk about politics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really smart because it makes it less intimidating.
Right. Like, I don't need a PhD to listen to this.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've got this conservative-leaning podcast hosted by a PhD in Navy vet.
Right.
We've got hot-button political topics.
Yeah.
We've got personal stories.
Yep.
We've got humor.
It's a good mix.
It's a good mix.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for the listener?
I think it means that this podcast is really trying to create a space for people who share their values to come together and talk about these issues.
Yeah, and feel like they belong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a community.
And feel like they're being given tools to understand the world.
And to think critically about these issues.
But within a certain framework.
Within a certain framework, yeah.
Right.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're going to help you think critically, but here are the parameters.
Right, this is how we're going to do it.
Exactly.
Okay, and, speaking of different perspectives, there's one episode that I'm really curious about, and that's the one with John Yoo.
Oh, yeah.
On the Matt Gaetz nomination for Attorney General.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's
a big one.
Potentially explosive.
Yeah, Matt Gaetz is a very polarizing figure.
Yeah, and John Yoo, I mean, he's a prominent legal scholar, but he's also...
He's been involved in
some
pretty
heated
debates.
Yeah. So how do you think they're going to handle this?
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. Are they gonna try to legitimize?
Yeah. Are they going to present a balanced view?
Yeah, Matt Gaetz's nomination.
Or are they just going to use it as a platform to...
Or are they just going to use it to kind of push their own agenda?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And how are they going to handle John Yoo's past?
Yeah.
I mean, are they going to address it?
Yeah. Or are they just going to...
Or are they just going to gloss over it?
Yeah.
It'll be fascinating to see.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. We'll find out.
But I'm definitely intrigued.
Me too.
Okay, listeners, get ready
Yeah.
for a deep dive
Thought Club.
into the world of legal and political controversies. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with a Republican professor.
We have.
Yeah, But I think there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
Oh, what's that?
That episode with the host's grandfather.
Oh, right. James A. Mather.
Yeah, James A. Mather, the World War II Navy pilot, and Mr. Steak founder.
Quite a story.
It really is. Like, you've got the heroism, you've got the entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, the classic American success story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's almost like they're tapping into this like collective memory.
Yeah, like the shared history.
Yeah, of what it means to be an American.
Right, and it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the podcast.
It does. It's like they're laying the groundwork for their perspective.
For their worldview,
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is where we're coming from.
Exactly.
These are the values that we hold dear.
Yeah, and it's a very effective way to connect with the audience.
Oh, for sure, because it's personal.
Yeah.
It's not just, some abstract ideology.
Right, exactly.
It's like, this is my family, this is my heritage.
And it makes you trust them more.
Right, yeah.
Because they're opening up and they're sharing something personal.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, now, let's talk about that episode with John Yoo on the Matt Gaetz nomination.
Right. That's a big one.
It's a big one, yeah.
I mean, Matt Gaetz is such a
controversial figure.
Polarizing figure.
Yeah, and John Yoo too. I mean, he's got his own baggage.
Yeah, with his involvement in
Bush administration and all that.
The torture memos and all of that.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are they trying to do here?
Right. Is this a calculated move?
Yeah. Are they trying to like rehabilitate Matt Gaetz's image?
Yeah.
Or are they just using it as a way to...
Yeah, or just like a platform to discuss
broader issues.
Yeah, broader legal principles or whatever.
Right.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, and it's a real test for them.
Yeah.
Because, they've made it clear that they have this...
Yeah, this conservative perspective. But they've also talked about logic and critical thinking.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, how do you hold those two ideas in your head at the same time?
Right. Can you be a critical thinker?
Yeah.
And also a staunch conservative?
Exactly.
I mean, I think you can.
I think so too.
But it's a tough...
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to see how they handle this.
Yeah, me too.
Because it could go either way.
It really could.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into the Republican Professor podcast. We've looked at the host. We've looked at the episode descriptions. We've talked about the website. We've talked about their use of storytelling.
The tone.
Yeah, what have we learned?
I think we've learned that this is a very carefully crafted podcast.
Right.
It's designed to appeal to a very specific audience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's using all of these different techniques to create a sense of community, to build trust, and to get people thinking.
Right, to get people thinking within a certain
framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just about presenting information.
Right.
It's about shaping how people see the world.
Yeah, it's about persuasion.
Exactly.
Okay, so if you're interested in exploring conservative ideas and you're looking for a podcast that's both informative and engaging, then the Republican Professor might be worth checking out.
It's definitely worth a listen.
Yeah, just be aware that they're coming at it from a particular perspective.
Right, they have an agenda.
Yeah, they have an agenda.
And that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay as long as you're aware of it.
Right, as long as you're listening critically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, folks, that's our deep dive into the Republican Professor.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.